And what happens though is after a while it'll just stop. I don't know how to change that setting.
Is the mic on?
The mic, does it have a green light on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Because it's corded and I didn't want Elena falling over in her sleep and knocking my cord off.
I'm awake, I'm just listening.
Oh, that makes sense. That's only half of the experience. Okay. Hey, so in my other classes, we didn't get through the quiz as fast, so you guys might get some extra learning today that the other classes didn't. Good for you. I know. And so so my lesson over here starts in 1491. That's the year before Columbus reaches the New World. The reason we start there is because the first thing we read this year was called 1491. If you remember, the article 1491 is in part designed to teach us things that we've always been taught wrong, especially old people like me. When I was a kid, I was taught that there weren't a whole lot of people in the New World before Columbus got here, that those people were largely hunters and gatherers, that those people were inferior. They just weren't as smart as Europeans, and so the way that Europeans took over the New World was because it was like Darwinism. They were just smarter and better at stuff. And most of those conceptions are wrong. For starters, the most important thing you should get out of 1491 is the term Columbian Exchange and the concept of the Columbian Exchange. The guy who wrote that article called the Columbian Exchange the most important event in the history of life on Earth since the death of the dinosaurs. I know, that's a pretty big, bold statement. The guy's clearly not Christian, or Muslim or anything like that. But the idea, the Columbian Exchange is the biological exchange of all this stuff that happens when Columbus comes here. Was Columbus the first European to come to the New World? No, there were other people, like Leif Erikson came, we know that, but there might have been other fishermen and all that kind of thing. But they didn't start the exchange of diseases and animals and plants and all that stuff. Before Columbus, there was no smallpox here. There was no influenza. And so native peoples of the New World didn't have any kinds of resistances to those diseases. So they were very prone to dying from those diseases. There were no horses, no pigs, no sheep, no goats, no cows in the New World before Columbus. And so there weren't animals to pull your plow. There was Native Americans often aren't able to digest milk, in part because historically they didn't drink milk because they didn't have animals they could milk. And so there were no tomatoes in Italy. There were no potatoes in Ireland. There were no peppers in Thailand.
No maize.
No
maize.
No maize in Europe, yes. No, none of that kind of corn. The Europeans, it's weird, you'll see old documents before Columbus and they'll talk about corn. They're really talking about wheat kernels that they call corn. But all of these exchanges have a massive effect on the entire world. Like, you can in part blame some of slavery on the fact that these New World crops get sent to Africa, and all that corn in Africa leads to overpopulation, which leads to tribal warfare, which leads to enslavement. You can look at, if your ancestors are Polish, then there's a good chance that there was overpopulation in Poland because of American corn that got grown in Poland, and then they ended up coming over here because there were too many people in Poland, that kind of thing, you know? And so all of this is a big deal. Probably most important is that the population of the New World was pretty big. Way bigger than they thought it was when I was a kid. Estimates are up to 200 million people in the New World, which would make North and South America have more people in it than Europe in 1491. And if there were that many people, there were only 500,000 Native Americans in the United States by 1900. And so that means that that over 100 million people died as a result of the Columbian Exchange as well. Over 100 million people died, yeah.
How many were in the New World?
They don't know. 200 million is the best guess that they have right now. It's gone up since that article was published. That article is 10 years old. Anyway, Europeans do come here. They early on there's dispute. Columbus was he wasn't Spanish. He was Italian, but he was sailing for the Spanish. And the Spanish said, since Columbus got here first, they got it all. The Portuguese claimed some of the New World also because they'd been doing some exploring. Eventually, the Pope settles it, and just like they did with the Missouri Compromise, they draw a line. And they draw a line. The Pope says, okay, they didn't even really have a good world map or anything, but the Pope just whips out a pencil or something and draws a line like right here and says, Portugal can have everything east of it, Spain gets everything west of it. The Portuguese were like, hooray, we get the Canary Islands. But really, the Spanish got the better of the deal. Nobody knew how much there was west of there, right? And so that's why much of Latin America speaks Spanish, is the Treaty of Tordesillas. That's also the treaty where the Pope says you can't enslave Christians.
Wait, doesn't Spain have the Canary Islands?
I think Spain has the Canary Islands now, but at the time the Portuguese got it. The Spanish, we talked about the Spanish sending over soldiers, right? The most famous of the conquistadors is Hernan Cortez. In 1519, he, with like 400 soldiers, takes over, defeats the Aztec Empire and takes it over. Francisco Pizarro does the same thing to the Inca Empire about 10 years later. So the Spanish have established this big old empire in Latin America before any English people are really settling in the New World. So Cortez does that in 1519. That's over 90 years before, or almost 90 years before Jamestown. What year is Jamestown founded?
1607.
1607. I get my 7s and 3s mixed up too. I don't know why. It's weird.
Odd number.
And I get 9s and 1 years mixed up too. I don't know. It's because they all add up to 10 somehow. Anyway, so Jamestown is founded, and they thought they could come here and get gold. It was founded by the Virginia Joint Stock Company, which was a group of London investors who wanted to send some young people over here to dig up some gold so they could get rich off of it, right? Turns out there was no gold. And the folks at Jamestown were having a hard time. They didn't send any farmers, and so they didn't really know how to farm. They got some food. The local natives were nice to them for a little while, the Powhatan Indians. And the Powhatan said, hey, we'll give you a little bit of corn. And the Powhatan thought we're showing them that we're superior to them because they can't live without us. The English thought, oh, we're superior to them, so they're paying us tribute, right? Eventually the Powhatan slow down on all that. The English start to die off. There's a period called the Starving Time that's like the winter of 1608 and 1609 where the 2/3 of the population of Jamestown starves. I went to a museum in Williamsburg, Virginia, and there were bones in this museum that I couldn't tell, but these were human bones that had human tooth marks on them because they were eating each other at Jamestown in 1609. And however, they get through that starving time with some help from the Powhatan Indians. I think that if someone, well, anyway, the Powhatan probably should have killed all the people at Jamestown when they got there, right? But they didn't. They were nice. Eventually, the daughter of the chief was a guy called Powhatan. All Indian tribes should be able to do that. And his daughter was Pocahontas. She makes friends with John Smith, who was one of the leaders of the Jamestown colony. She also makes friends with John Rolfe. She eventually marries John Rolfe, and this creates something of a peace treaty between the English and the Powhatan. Meanwhile, the Powhatan were dying off because of European diseases, and the English were getting stronger. When finally the Powhatan decide we're going to kill the English folks now after Pocahontas is dead, the English are too strong, and the English invite them to a peace dinner and give them some poison wine, and there are no more Powhatan around. Yeah, what? Poison wine? Yeah. So John Smith, can anybody quote John Smith? Those who shall not work. Those who shall not work shall not eat. And because there were all kinds of people like with noble titles saying, I don't work in the fields, but then they were eating all the food. So John Smith helps to get them through that starving time. Jamestown is dependent on, eventually indentured servants become the main workforce. That John Rolfe guy who married Pocahontas also figures out a type of tobacco that will be valuable, so business gets good at Jamestown, and they end up surviving. Hooray for Jamestown. Eventually, by 1619, they established the House of Burgesses, which is it's a representative body where they vote on stuff. It doesn't sound real democratic to us. It was like the richest folks get to go do some voting, but at least they were voting instead of having one person in charge. And this is early instances of democracy. Rachel?
I know it's kind of a weird question, but like, is the House of Burgesses, like, just the house itself still around, or like, is it?
No, the House of Burgesses originally met in the church at Jamestown.
Oh, so they didn't have
And so it was just, and then they moved it, the capital moves a couple times there. I don't know if there was ever a building that was the House of Burgesses.
Did it turn into like the capital?
The House of Burgesses is a colonial establishment, and so once the British are driven out, they elect a governor and all this kind of thing.
So it was still there for a while.
Yeah, it was there until 1776, I think, is when they elect Jefferson, the first governor of Virginia. Anyway, so you guys know about indentured servants. We got to House of Burgesses. The 1619 is also the first year with that African slave ship. We talked about tobacco. Let's move north to Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, the Mayflower is the ship that lands on Plymouth Rock in 1620. That's the first pilgrims that come here. Some of them are Puritans and some of them are separatists. You don't really need to know the difference. You just need to know that there were those two groups, because sometimes they'll use those two vocab words. Before they even land that ship on Plymouth Rock, they signed something called the Mayflower Compact. Because on the ship there were Puritans and separatists who disagreed on some stuff, they wrote down some rules for when they landed. Rules like, we'll vote on stuff. Rules like, if somebody's accused of a crime, we'll have a jury of our peers. Again, this is an example of written constitutions that's early in the American history, right? Eventually, the Plymouth colony, 10 years later, a whole lot more Puritans come and form the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It swallows up the Plymouth colony, and it's all these Puritans in Massachusetts is what they're called. The leader of that group at the Massachusetts Bay Colony is John Winthrop. He gives that city on a hill speech. If you have Miss Ramsey, you read that in detail, probably for 3 weeks.
Yep.
All right. Nice. All right. It's nice. You guys you haven't made it to 1900 in Ms. Ramsey's class, have you?
No.
We're on 20 right now.
20?
Yeah.
All right. Good deal. He's been dead for more than 100 years. I'm sorry. It's okay. Mark Twain's fun. Are you reading
We're reading
The Mysterious Stranger? That's nice. I like that. I like how Satan's just kind of a fun guy. I was hanging out with Satan.
He says, he's like, my name's Satan, and they're like, cool.
Yeah, I know.
That's my uncle. Like, no, you actually know.
Okay, anyway, we talked earlier about Roger Williams founding Rhode Island. He did this because he had different religious views. William Penn founds Pennsylvania, and he says, hey, yeah, you can come worship here however you want. A guy named George Calvert, who was Lord of Baltimore, was given Maryland, and he says, hey, let's let the Catholics go there. And so a lot of these places are founded with the idea that different religious groups are going to be able to worship how they want there. Yes, ma'am?
Where'd the separatists go after the Puritans swallowed?
They just kind of got swallowed up into the Puritan church. That became less of an argument because they found out they got here and there was so little contact with England that difference on the Anglican church was just not that big a deal to them anymore.
Okay.
Yeah. And so those places are called proprietary colonies. They were colonies given to individuals by the king. Like George Calvert, the king owed George Calvert some money, and so the king was like, "I'll give you Maryland," which is like me saying, "Hey Barrett, I owe you $100. Can I just give you a chunk of land on the moon? Because I'm never going there. Might as well, you know." It sounds like a good deal. In 1676, there's something called Bacon's Rebellion. We were supposed to have a whole rebellion thing, but we don't have time. So Nathaniel Bacon was a Western Virginia farmer. He was kind of new to Virginia, and he wanted to take some land from the Indians and grow tobacco on this land. And he wasn't getting support from the Virginia government, and this was frustrating to him. And so he got a bunch of his neighbors to march to Jamestown to ask for an army to go clear some Indians off some land. And the House of Burgesses says, no, you can't do that. The House of Burgesses was all from Eastern Virginia. They already had their tobacco farms. They didn't want more tobacco farms coming in because that was going to lower the price of tobacco, right? So they said no, but then Bacon and his guys put guns to their heads and they say, okay, you can have an army. Bacon and his army start marching back to Western Virginia, and then he dies of dysentery and the whole thing ends. However, this is an example of Western farmers who get frustrated with Eastern elites who don't understand them. And so they take up arms against those Eastern elites. This still goes on. Last year, you remember last year, a bunch of folks took over the Malheur wildlife reservation, right? And they went in there with their guns and said, we don't like the way the government uses this land, we're taking it. That's Western farmers who are angry about the Eastern elite not understanding what it's like to be in the West. And we see that with rebellions all the time. Say again?
That just sounds like teenage angst.
A little bit, yeah, but a little bit of it's real. Like, the American Revolution is very much people on the western side of the ocean saying, you don't understand us, London.
Yeah.
And there is some teenage angst in it, but eventually you have to become a grown-up, right? I think that's good. We were at Bacon's Rebellion. We talked about mercantilism the other day. It's an economic system where the mother country takes natural resources from its colonies and then turns them into finished goods and sells it back to them for more than they bought. The triangle trade is an example of that. Yeah. It's all that system of, and you make money on every step, right? Because of the mercantile system, so mercantilism, there are always documents on the AP test that are like navigation acts. And the navigation acts were the rules that said you can only sell your goods to England, or you can only ship your goods on British ships and that sort of thing. It was to enforce the mercantile system. As long as the British were making money, they didn't have to spend a bunch of time or a bunch of effort controlling the colonists, so they treated them with salutary neglect. In the mid-1700s, the First Great Awakening happens. This is a religious movement. The two most famous preachers from that are George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Again, if you have Ms. Ramsey, you probably read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I know, and like God's holding you over the pit of hell and you better be good or else he'll drop you. And so a bunch of Americans were like, I don't want God to drop me. And so they decided to go to church and be good and all that kind of thing. Religion got more popular. They built a bunch of colleges to train American preachers. We talked about colonial regions last time. I'm going to skip past that. And we're all the way, we went straight from the Great Awakening to the French and Indian War. Remember that the French and Indian War was not between the French and the Indians. The French and the Indians were on one side. The Americans and the British were on the other. There were a couple Indian tribes that sided with the British, but largely the Indians liked the French more. The British win the French and Indian War, which is also called the 7 Years' War. They get all the land from the Appalachian Mountains over to the Mississippi River. The British also gain Canada in that. So France is driven off the American continent. They'll get Louisiana in a couple of years. Bless you. Because that war was so expensive, they decide to end the British decided to end salutary neglect. The real end of salutary neglect is the Proclamation of 1763, where the British say, hey colonists, you can't go past the Appalachian Mountains. Even though we got all this land in that war, you can't move over there. And also, we're going to leave 10,000 troops in America to keep an eye on you. Then the British start taxing the American citizens. They pass a tax on sugar. They say the Americans can't print their own currency. These were frustrating to the Americans, but some people accepted them and said, you know, if we're going to be part of this empire, then if we're going to buy sugar that comes across the ocean as part of this empire, then we'll pay a tax on that. They were really mad at the Stamp Act because the Stamp Act was seen as an internal tax. The Stamp Act was a tax on paper goods. And that tax on paper goods meant that if I cut down a tree on my own land and turn it into paper and then make those into playing cards and sell them, I have to pay a tax? Why should any of that money go to London, right? I don't get to vote on what taxes are going on in London, and that's not an imperial thing, that's an internal tax. Americans complain vigorously about that. They start to boycott British goods. They have a Stamp Act Congress where they plan this boycott. They burn down some tax collectors' houses, and the British finally say, "Oh, we give up. We'll abolish the Stamp Act." So the Americans are learning, hey, if we throw a fit, the British will give in. The British continue to want to tax the Americans, and they do so through the Townshend Acts, which are a bunch of like there's a molasses tax and there's a lead tax and stuff like that. I also skipped the Boston Tea Party here. Is that thing still running?
Yeah.
Woo! I also skipped the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was in 1773. And the Boston Tea Party, one of the things you don't get about the Boston Tea Party, it just seems like they threw a little tea in the harbor. It was a lot of tea. It was really, really valuable. And so this was a major loss to the British East India Company. So the British were really mad. They decided to punish Boston for this. And they punished Boston through the Intolerable Acts, which are also called the Coercive Acts. They should only give it one name. You guys kind of match. That's nice.
You know what? You should write the AP tests.
I should. That'd be great. And I should name everything.
Ours are doing the AP test based on
Anyway, so the Intolerable Acts say, we're going to punish Boston because they're the ones causing all this trouble. It closes down the Boston Harbor. It closes down the Massachusetts Assembly. And it says that in most court cases that are, I think it was just in murder cases, that they couldn't have those cases in the Massachusetts courts. They'd have to send those people to England to go on trial, where they'd have an English jury and be likely to be convicted. And so the British thought that this would scare the rest of the colonies, but really this made the rest of the colonies mad and put them even more on Boston's side. Eventually, there's a quiet period. Everybody's like gathering guns and ammunition. And in 1775, I think it was in May, June. It's in May. Patriots Day. Are you from Massachusetts? When's Patriots Day? Is that in May?
Yeah, let's say it's like May 8th.
Okay, like today?
Oh, God.
I don't know.
Somebody Google
I
Patriots
just
Day.
remember my aunt would always run
The marathon is
the
on that
marathon.
day. Yeah.
Or a marathon.
Yeah, the Boston Marathon is
Oh,
on
then that's
Patriots Day.
August. Then that's April, like early April then.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, you don't have to know the day of Lexington and Concord, but Lexington and Concord is April 16th? Okay, April 16th. All right. So at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world is the start of the revolution, but they don't know exactly what they're fighting for. They're just mad that the British are trying to take their guns. Eventually, the colonial leadership comes together at the Second Continental Congress. They vote to send an olive branch petition to the king saying, hey, king, we have this deal where you're supposed to protect us and we'll obey you. You're not protecting us from Congress. Will you please, or from the what's it called? The British Parliament. And so if you will get Parliament to calm down, we'll continue to obey you, king. And the king writes back and says, no, you're in treason. We're going to hang you. And so they say, oh my goodness, and they declare independence. You should familiarize yourself with the Declaration of Independence. That's July 1776. The Battle of Saratoga is not just a military turning point. The Battle of Saratoga is an American victory that shows the French that the Americans might win this thing. If the Americans might win this thing, it's in the French's interest to come in on the American side because they want to poke England in the eye, right? And so the French join the war. We probably don't win the war without the French. That's in 1777. The Battle of Yorktown is the last major battle of the war. The Americans pinned down the British at Yorktown. I'm not sure which, but so if you're a child in Virginia, they teach you the geography of Virginia by having your hand like this, because there are these little peninsulas here. One of them is where Yorktown is, and the British are pinned down. 60,000 British troops are trapped at Yorktown. The French Navy is off the coast, so they can't run away, so they have to surrender. It takes a couple years, and I didn't get it on the board for some reason, but the Treaty of Paris is the agreement that ends the war. And that's in 1783. The Americans had been, the Americans thought, like most people didn't think, hey, I'm an American. They thought, I'm a Pennsylvanian, or I'm a Virginian, or I'm a Massachusettsian, however you say that. And actually, John Adams always calls himself a Massachusetts man. And so they didn't know exactly how to join together. They decided to join together in this very loose union that they called a League of Friendship that was the Articles of Confederation. It's really weak, and the British take advantage of them in trade. They can't really raise an army, so when Shays' Rebellion happens in 1787, he's a Western Massachusetts farmer who's mad at the Eastern elites. And he tries to take over Massachusetts, and he almost does. And they're like, we need to be able to put down these rebellions. And so the Articles of Confederation are a failure. The one thing that they do end up accomplishing is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is a peaceful way to get new states into the Union. After Shays' Rebellion, they get together in Pennsylvania to write a constitution. James Madison is the father of the Constitution and wrote most of it. Everybody always talks about the Constitution like it's scripture. There's some bad stuff in the Constitution. I mean, the whole 3/5 of a person thing. There's like, the Constitution is not this perfect document sent down to us by God or something like that. It's got some flaws, but one of the things that it has is the ability to change it. It's a living document, right? And so they can amend it, they can change it. If you look at it in the book, I think the parts that have been changed, they like just cross out, which is kind of cool. Like they cross out the 3/5 of a person part. They cross out the 18th Amendment after they write the 21st Amendment, stuff like that. The Constitution didn't follow all the rules. In a way, it was kind of a coup d'etat, like they were overthrowing the government, because it didn't follow the rules set forward in the Articles of Confederation for changing the Articles of Confederation. So they decided to make sure that it was cool with the people, that they have to get it ratified by all the states. And that ratification process, some states don't like it. New York is really thinking they're not going to ratify it. And so a whole bunch of articles are written called the Federalist Papers. These are the things that these show up on the AP test all the time. And the Federalist Papers are a description of why the states should join into this new constitutional government. They're written by, a couple of them are written by John Jay, but the rest are written by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And they explain why we should have a constitution. So if it says on the AP test, Federalist 10, or Federalist 26, or Federalist 51, then they're talking about the Federalist Papers, and they're trying to convince the people to accept the Constitution. One of the main criticisms of the Constitution was that it didn't protect Americans' individual rights. And so they promised, hey, as soon as we get the new government, we'll write a Bill of Rights. So the new government in 1789 includes the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Those are written by James Madison as well. This new government is an all-star team. Who's the first president? George Washington. What about vice president? This table isn't a good one. John Adams. How about Secretary of the Treasury? Alexander Hamilton. How about the first Secretary of State? Jefferson. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? John Jay. the lost founding father. They really put it on. Actually, no, they shouldn't put John Jay on any money. They should put Harriet Tubman on some money. Damn it. Anyway, so that's an all-star team, right? Part of the Washington's idea of how this is supposed to work is it's supposed to be dynamic tension. So he's got two of the smartest people in American history, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who are always arguing with each other, and Washington kind of charts a middle course. But he knows the country has to be strong, and that's more of the Hamiltonian argument. And so Washington listens to Hamilton more than he listens to Jefferson. Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury. The United States, our biggest problem since the Revolution had been financial. And Hamilton finds a way to get the American government on a track. It's through several reports on public credit. Basically what he says is the federal government's going to take on all the debts of the states, and Then we'll pay off those debts by borrowing money from the wealthiest Americans and also some wealthy Europeans and some European banks and stuff. And then we'll pay it off over time, and we'll just run a continual debt. Debt doesn't sound like a good thing. However, like, this is how grown-ups work, right? So, like, Ms. Ramsey and I, one of the things that Hamilton does as Secretary of Treasury is he wants to make sure that the American people understand that the government can tax you. And so he places a tax on whiskey. This seems fair because that, you know, we shouldn't drink whiskey anyways, right? And so however, a lot of farmers in the West were whiskey producers because it's hard to move all your wheat or barley across the mountains and everything. So if you boil it down into a smaller package that's more valuable, then it makes sense, and you can make a profit doing that. And plus, with whiskey, once you turn it into whiskey, it gains value instead of like going bad. It supposedly gets better. It all tastes horrible to me, but so a bunch of people in Western Pennsylvania are not paying the whiskey tax. And so Hamilton and Washington say, ooh, now we can show off our new army. And so they mount up so Washington and Hamilton put on uniforms and get on horses and lead a 13,000 soldier army into Western Pennsylvania looking for whiskey rebels. The whiskey rebels just go back to being farmers like the Viet Cong or something like that. And so they're like, they arrest 6 people, I think. But it's a show of force, and a lot of the time on the AP test, they'll ask you to compare the government's response to Shays' Rebellion to that of the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington also wants us to stay neutral. He doesn't want us to get involved in European wars. The British and the French are at each other's throats during this time. France says, hey, America, you should help us in our fight against the British. We helped you when you fought against the British, so you should help us. They had a treaty. But the Americans said, sorry, that treaty doesn't count anymore because you chopped off the king's head who signed the treaty. And Washington declares us neutral in 1793, keeping us out of those European wars. Yes, Sarah?
I'm really sorry, but can you
That's
go
cool.
over Shays' Rebellion again? I forgot what it was.
Yeah, so Daniel Shays was a Western farmer. I might have skipped that part. He was a Western Massachusetts farmer who was in debt. And he was in debt in part because Massachusetts had raised his taxes. And he and a bunch of other farmers went around breaking up debtors' courts and debtors' prisons. Eventually they march on Springfield, which was where the Massachusetts kept its guns. And they were going to steal all the guns, but they called together a militia, and Shays' Rebellion was put down by that militia. But it was so scary because some people were like, hey, the federal army should fight these guys. It's a rebellion. But we didn't have a federal army because the Articles of Confederation were so weak. I think I skipped that part. Washington also in 1797, he decides to leave office. And which is really important that he decided to step down and just saying, I'm going to stay president till I die. And he decides he's going to step down. He gives a farewell address, which is really a letter to a newspaper. But in that farewell address, he says we should stay out of entangling alliances, stay out of Europe's problems. And we should also avoid political parties. Political parties just bicker. This was 1797. So that's Washington's farewell. That's also the year, it might be 1793, but that's also the time when the cotton gin expands the usefulness of slavery. John Adams becomes president right when France is getting even crazier than it was before. And we start conflict with France. We send diplomats to France, and those diplomats are treated disrespectfully. This is called the Xyz Affair. Americans are angry about this and think we ought to declare war because they insulted us. Which is a lame reason for a war. We end up in what's called a quasi-war. Quasi means kinda. So we're kind of at war with the French. Like our ships would fight with French ships in the Caribbean and in the Mediterranean. We don't have land troops fighting against the French. Adams works hard to keep us out of a war with France because that might be the end of us. Eventually, he's criticized by a lot of Americans who think we need to fight the French because they're being rude to us. Adams responds to this by pushing through Congress the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were laws that allowed him to put newspaper editors in jail. And this is contrary to the First Amendment, but the courts really didn't have a way of, it wasn't challenged in the courts because the courts didn't have a good system of dealing with that stuff yet. We'll get to that in just a sec. Either way, John Adams loses in the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson calls this the Revolution of 1800 because this is the first time in like world history where we had an election and we switched from one party to another. Like one day they have the people vote, and then John Adams moves out of the White House. Thomas Jefferson walks down the street from a hotel and goes into the White House, and he's the president now. It's pretty amazing, right? And it's cool. Like he's simple. And he just like Jefferson intentionally that day did not wear a wig. He wore plain clothes. He walked from the hotel where he was staying. He didn't have a horse-drawn carriage or some crap like that. He was like, I'm just an American citizen moving into that house over there. And this was important too because the Republicans, remember, they were the party who didn't like the Constitution at first. And so some people thought Jefferson was just going to tear that sucker up. He didn't. The first important thing that happens during the Jefferson presidency is the Marbury versus Madison decision. This establishes judicial review. The Supreme Court didn't have a real strong role before this, but basically, I don't want to go through the whole case. In Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court says, here's what we do. If a law is unconstitutional, we strike it down and it's not law anymore. And this is important in the checks and balances, right? The courts, the Congress writes the laws, the president gets to either veto them or not, or sign them into law, and the Supreme Court gets to decide whether or not they're constitutional. And that all balances each other out, right? That's the Marbury versus Madison decision that gives us judicial review. Jefferson purchases Louisiana from France, doubling the size of the United States. We fight a war after the Jefferson presidency with England. We basically fight to a draw. You don't need to know that much about the War of 1812. But after the War of 1812, the Federalists had basically died out. And so we have briefly the era of good feelings, which really just makes it onto my board because I love that name. Like everybody was happy. The political parties were getting along for like 11 months. And then they started arguing again. There was the Panic of 1819. You read a play about that called Don't Panic. And this was really part of the boom-bust cycle, right? Also in 1820, we start arguing about slavery again. We have the Missouri Compromise. In 1823, President James Monroe gives the Monroe Doctrine. And in the Monroe Doctrine, it's foreign policy. Doctrine generally means foreign policy. And this was at a time when a whole bunch of those Latin American countries had revolutions. Mexico had a revolution right around then. Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, those places. And the Americans, and they had formed fledgling republics, right? And we were really proud of this. Like, we thought they were kind of following our example. And so Monroe says what we don't want is now that Colombia broke away from Spain, we don't want France to just come in and recolonize them. So we said, hey, Europe, you stay out of these countries. Don't try and recolonize them. And in exchange, because we'll fight you, and in exchange, we'll stay out of your stupid wars. And so this is America saying we're going to stay out of Europe's crazy forever war that they seem to fight with themselves all the time, and that we're going to stay on our side of the ocean. We keep that promise, at least with Europe, until World War I. Where are we? Monroe Doctrine. The only having one political party thing kind of falls apart in 1824 when there are 4 candidates and none of them have enough votes for the presidency, and so Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams make a backroom deal so that Adams will get the presidency. That's called the Corrupt Bargain of 1824. This is during the Second Great Awakening, which is a religious revival. It's an evangelical Christian revival, and where everybody can go to heaven as long as you accept Jesus Christ and you do good Christian works, right? So that leads to a lot of reformers. We'll get to them in a second. Andrew Jackson becomes president in 1829. He changes the name of that political party of the Democratic Republicans. He starts calling them just the Democrats. So those Democratic Republicans kind of die out then. But it's really the same party. Jackson thinks that all white men are just as important as other white men. And one of the things white men want is land. And how do you get land? You kick Indians off of it. Yes, ma'am.
Wait, so in Jack's
Jackson changed the Democrat Republicans to Democrats?
Democrats,
Is
yeah.
Is that the Democrats today? Or
That's the Democrats today. I mean, they believe totally different things. Like, it's all switched
Or
around.
like the
but it's
lineage.
the lineage. That's the
Yeah.
blue line that starts from Thomas Jefferson and goes all the way to Nancy Pelosi or Barack Obama.
So you would say that the switch probably happened near the Great Depression?
Really, the progressive era.
Progressive era.
Yeah. But then it's really widens in the Depression. Yeah. Okay, and so we are at Jackson also is a strong believer in the Union. So when South Carolina said, hey, we don't have to follow federal law, Jackson threatened to go down there and start hanging people. This is called the Nullification Crisis because South Carolina was nullifying federal law and Jackson said, you can't do that. This is important because it's kind of foreshadowing for the Civil War because the South Carolina is the ones who quit, who leave in the Civil War, right?
What's nullified?
To nullify is to declare void or to make
Just
not
like
valid,
ignore the law.
to invalidate.
Oh, in
Yeah. So if Oregon nullified federal marijuana laws within Oregon by saying that marijuana can be recreational marijuana can be sold.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's still kind of touchy area though, you know. As we can see by that marijuana leaf on your hat.
This is Adidas.
I know, I'm kidding. If you want to see marijuana leaves, you can see them everywhere. Maritza Medina has a shirt on today with a marijuana leaf on it, is what it looks like. But I know Maritza Medina doesn't have a marijuana leaf on her shirt, it just looks like a marijuana leaf, you know what I mean? Good job. There's another panic in 1837. We skipped the bank war. So Henry Clay is Andrew Jackson's nemesis. We're going to get through the Civil War before this whole thing's done, kid. Henry Clay is the nemesis of Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay thinks he can get political points by rechartering the Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson thinks, no, the Bank of the United States is a tool of the rich people. And so Andrew Jackson decides he says, Mr. Clay thinks that the bank will kill me, but I will kill it. And so he destroys the national bank, which leads to instability in the economy. But the American, like his people, his farmers are like, yeah, I hate banks. And so Jackson gains political points through that bank war, but it leads to political instability for until 1913. Including it leads to the Panic of 1837. The opposition to Jackson calls itself the Whigs. This is the new second party. Their leader is Henry Clay. Also during this time we have a lot of antebellum reformers. Antebellum means before war. In American English that always means before the Civil War. So it's the period like 1800 to 1861. And these people are folks who say, hey, we can make the world a better place. And we should, because that's part of our mission as Christians in this whole Second Great Awakening, right? So Horace Mann says we need to build schools for kids. Horace Mann is in, so if you don't like grades like ABC, blame Horace Mann. If you don't like grades like first, second, third, blame Horace Mann. That's all his ideas, right? Dorothea Dix thought mental institutions should be reformed and prisons should be reformed. So she led that charge. Lyman Beecher was the guy who was saying nobody should work on Sundays except preachers. And that's not really work. And so he was the head of the Sabbatarian movement. A whole bunch of different women were leading the temperance movement, which wanted to limit alcohol use. The Abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement kind of splits in the 1830s. The women's rights movement is led by Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We read that Declaration of Sentiments last time by them that was like the Declaration of Independence. And there are a lot of abolitionists, but the one name that comes up the most is William Lloyd Garrison. He's a radical abolitionist, so he's like, he says, end slavery now, don't compensate slave owners because they're evil. If the black people decide they're going to start killing white folks, the white folks had it coming. And so he's like, do it now. His newspaper is called The Liberator, and that's the most influential of the abolitionist publications. I skipped the little orange star means I forgot some stuff, or it's out of time order. I didn't get any slave rebellions in there. There are a few slave rebellions here, or I have 3 of them. Gabriel's Rebellion, sometimes it's called Gabriel Prosser's Rebellion or Prosser's Rebellion. I think we talked about this because he was a slave, and Prosser was his slave owner's name, and they called him Gabriel Prosser for a long time, but really now they call it Gabriel's Rebellion because he wouldn't use Prosser. Denmark Vesey was a free man. He's the one who won the lottery and bought his own freedom. So Gabriel Prosser is 1800, Denmark Vesey is 1822, Nat Turner's conspiracy is in 1831. All of these are literate black folks who led rebellions that were unsuccessful. All 3 of them were turned in by other enslaved people who were worried that they would be harmed because of this thing. And all of these made slave owners more harsh on the enslaved people. Does that make sense?
It didn't help in any way.
Well,
for abolition.
I'm not sure. So that's a great question. One of the most important things I can tell you about the end of slavery, and I don't do a good job of it with this presentation methodology, one of the most important things I can tell you is that the people who ended slavery the most were enslaved people, right? And yeah, some of them were fighting rebellions, but some of them were just not working very hard. And some of them were burning down the barn, and some of them were pretending not to speak English and all that, but they fought it every day. They maintained their culture, all that kind of thing. There was organized resistance to slavery on every plantation in America. As a kid, I was taught white people did something bad with slavery, but then white people ended up ending slavery, so hooray for white people. They're really awesome. And that's not the way we should get it. So, I don't know. I think that it increased the pressure, right? You know what I mean? Yeah, so sometimes, I don't know.
Kind of pushed up both ends.
Yeah. All right. Okay. There were also during this period utopian societies. A utopian society. So this is when America. We're going to make it to the beginning of the Civil War. This is when America was industrializing too. You know, factories and all that stuff, railroads. Cities were growing, and a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, the world is going crazy. It's changing so much. I must break away from society and form my own community. So the people at the Oneida community said the problem with American society is monogamy. So we should have free love at our community. The Shakers said, no, the problem's sex. And so they decided not to have any sex at all and just dance. Yes, sir. The Shakers did the weird dance. Shake now, shaking those, shaking a lot of stuff. Yeah. And Brook Farm was a bunch of transcendentalists, including Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. The Mormons, you guys know about the Mormons going west. Another utopian society was the folks in Massachusetts earlier on. These are people who say, hey, we need to go someplace else and be with people who think the same things as us. Okay, we fight a war with Mexico from 1846 to 1848, and we take a bunch of land. This leads to a renewed arguing over slavery and what's going to happen on that land. The Wilmot Proviso opens that up. That's the one that said we won't allow slavery in lands we take from Mexico. The Compromise of 1850 we discussed earlier. That brings California into the Union. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which inspires a lot of Americans to be anti-slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act said, hey, we'll let people vote on whether or not they're going to have slavery in their state, but every crazy person in America goes to Kansas to fight about it. That's bleeding Kansas. The idea that we can vote is popular sovereignty. Dred Scott v. Sanford is the court case where the enslaved person went to Wisconsin and thought he was free, but the Supreme Court says, no, you're not free, you're not even a person. And if you were a person, then you wouldn't be free because the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. John Brown says, I know how to solve the problem, let's start a war. And he steals a bunch of guns, but then he's captured and hanged. And then Lincoln's elected and South Carolina secedes, and I'll tell you what happens after that the next time. Next time on AP US History. Yeah. Carlos falls asleep.
Have you ever seen this history of the world video? just like, when it's like, a really tense, like, oh,
Yeah.
we can turn it on again. Okay,
Yeah.
we should be talking
All right.
about
Oh, that's a good idea.
It's like,
I'm gonna turn it off now.
Thank you.